Temple Trouble, Henry B. Piper. Through a haze of incense and altar smoke, Yatazar looked down from his golden throne at the end of the dusky, many-pillared temple. Yatazar was an idol, of gigantic size and extraordinarily good workmanship. He had 3 eyes, made of turquoises as big as doorknobs, and 6 arms. In his 3 right hands, from top to bottom, he held a sword with a flame-shaped blade, a jeweled object of vaguely phallic appearance, and, by the ears, a rabbit. In his left hands were a bronze torch with burnished copper flames, a big goblet, and a pair of scales with an egg in one pan balanced against a skull in the other. He had a long bifurcate beard made of gold wire, feet like a bird's, and other rather startling anatomical features. His throne was set upon a stone plinth about 20 feet high, into the front of which a doorway opened. Behind him was a wooden screen, elaborately gilded and painted. Directly in front of the idol, Ghulam the high priest knelt on a big blue and gold cushion. He wore a gold-fringed robe of dark blue, and a tall conical gold mitre, and a bright blue false beard, forked like the idol's golden one. He was intoning a prayer, and holding up, in both hands, for divine inspection and approval, a long curved knife. Behind him, about 30 feet away, stood a square stone altar, around which 4 of the lesser priests, in light blue robes with less gold fringe and dark blue false beards, were busy with the preliminaries to the sacrifice. At considerable distance, about halfway down the length of the temple, some 200 worshippers, a few substantial citizens in gold-fringed tunics, artisans in tunics without gold fringe, soldiers in mail hauberks and plain steel caps, 1 officer in ornately gilded armor, a number of peasants in nondescript smocks, and women of all classes were beginning to prostrate themselves on the stone floor. Ghulam rose to his feet, bowing deeply to Yatazar and holding the knife extended in front of him, and backed away toward the altar. As he did, one of the lesser priests reached into a fringed and embroidered sack and pulled out a live rabbit, a big one, obviously of domestic breed, holding it by the ears while one of his fellows took it by the hind legs. A third priest caught up a silver pitcher, while the 4th fanned the altar fire with a sheet silver fan. As they began chanting antiphonally, Ghulam turned and quickly whipped the edge of his knife across the rabbit's throat. The priest with the pitcher stepped in to catch the blood, and when the rabbit was bled, it was laid on the fire. Ghulam and his 4 assistants all shouted together, and the congregation shouted in response. The high priest waited as long as was decently necessary and then, holding the knife in front of him, stepped around the prayer cushion and went through the door under the idol into the Holy of Holies. A boy in novice's white robes met him and took the knife, carrying it reverently to a fountain for washing. 8 or 10 under-priests, sitting at a long table, rose and bowed, then sat down again and resumed their eating and drinking. At another table, a half-dozen upper priests nodded to him in casual greeting. Crossing the room, Ghulam went to the triple veil in front of the house of Yatazar, where only the highest of the priesthood might go, and parted the curtains, passing through, until he came to the great gilded door. Here he fumbled under his robe and produced a small object like a mechanical pencil, inserting the pointed end in a tiny hole in the door and pressing on the other end. The door opened, then swung shut behind him, and as it locked itself, the lights came on within. Ghulam removed his mitre and his false beard, tossing them aside on a table, then undid his sash and peeled out of his robe. His regalia discarded, he stood for a moment in loose trousers and a soft white shirt, with a pistol-like weapon in a shoulder holster under his left arm. No longer Ghulam the high priest of Yatazar, but now Stranus Leth, resident agent on this timeline of the 4th-level Proto-Aryan sector for the Transtemporal Mining Corporation. Then he opened a door at the other side of the anteroom and went to the antigraph shaft, stepping over the edge and floating downward. Through a haze of incense and altar smoke, Yatazar looked down from his golden throne at the end of the dusky, many-pillared temple. Yatazar was an idol, of gigantic size and extraordinarily good workmanship. He had 3 eyes, made of turquoises as big as doorknobs, and 6 arms. In his 3 right hands, from top to bottom, he held a sword with a flame-shaped blade, a jeweled object of vaguely phallic appearance, and, by the ears, a rabbit. In his left hands were a bronze torch with burnished copper flames, a big goblet, and a pair of scales with an egg in one pan balanced against a skull in the other. He had a long bifurcate beard made of gold wire, feet like a bird's, and other rather startling anatomical features. His throne was set upon a stone plinth about 20 feet high, into the front of which a doorway opened. Behind him was a wooden screen, elaborately gilded and painted. Directly in front of the idol, Ghulam the high priest knelt on a big blue and gold cushion. He wore a gold-fringed robe of dark blue, and a tall conical gold mitre, and a bright blue false beard, forked like the idol's golden one. He was intoning a prayer, and holding up, in both hands, for divine inspection and approval, a long curved knife. Behind him, about 30 feet away, stood a square stone altar, around which 4 of the lesser priests, in light blue robes with less gold fringe and dark blue false beards, were busy with the preliminaries to the sacrifice. At considerable distance, about halfway down the length of the temple, some 200 worshippers, a few substantial citizens in gold-fringed tunics, artisans in tunics without gold fringe, soldiers in mail hauberks and plain steel caps, one officer in ornately gilded armor, a number of peasants in nondescript smocks, and women of all classes were beginning to prostrate themselves on the stone floor. Ghulam rose to his feet, bowing deeply to Yatazar and holding the knife extended in front of him, and backed away toward the altar. As he did, one of the lesser priests reached into a fringed and embroidered sack and pulled out a live rabbit, a big one, obviously of domestic breed, holding it by the ears while one of his fellows took it by the hind legs. A third priest caught up a silver pitcher, while the fourth fanned the altar fire with a sheet silver fan. As they began chanting antiphonally, Ghulam turned and quickly whipped the edge of his knife across the rabbit's throat. The priest with the pitcher stepped in to catch the blood, and when the rabbit was bled, it was laid on the fire. Ghulam and his 4 assistants all shouted together, and the congregation shouted in response. The high priest waited as long as was decently necessary and then, holding the knife in front of him, stepped around the prayer cushion and went through the door under the idol into the Holy of Holies. A boy in novice's white robes met him and took the knife, carrying it reverently to a fountain for washing. 8 or 10 under-priests, sitting at a long table, rose and bowed, then sat down again and resumed their eating and drinking. At another table, a half-dozen upper priests nodded to him in casual greeting. Crossing the room, Ghulam went to the triple veil in front of the house of Yatazar, where only the highest of the priesthood might go, and parted the curtains, passing through, until he came to the great gilded door. Here he fumbled under his robe and produced a small object like a mechanical pencil, inserting the pointed end in a tiny hole in the door and pressing on the other end. The door opened, then swung shut behind him, and as it locked itself, the lights came on within. Ghulam removed his mitre and his false beard, tossing them aside on a table, then undid his sash and peeled out of his robe. His regalia discarded, he stood for a moment in loose trousers and a soft white shirt, with a pistol-like weapon in a shoulder holster under his left arm. No longer Ghulam the high priest of Yatazar, but now Stranis Leth, resident agent on this timeline of the 4th level Proto-Aryan sector for the Transtemporal Mining Corporation. Then he opened a door at the other side of the anteroom and went to the antigraph shaft, stepping over the edge and floating downward. Stranis Leth, dropping to the bottom of the antigraph shaft, cast a hasty and instinctive glance to the right, where the freight conveyors were. One was gone, taking its cargo over hundreds of thousands of para-years to the 1st level. Another had just returned, empty, and a third was receiving its cargo from the robot mining machines far back under the mountain. 2 young men and a girl, in 1st level costumes, sat at a bank of instruments and visor screens, handling the whole operation, and 6 or 7 armed guards, having inspected the newly arrived conveyor and finding that it had picked up nothing inimical en route, were relaxing and lighting cigarettes. 3 of them, Stranis Leth noticed, wore the green uniforms of the Paratime Police. When did those fellows get in? He asked the people at the control desk, nodding toward the green-clad newcomers. About 10 minutes ago, on the passenger conveyor, the girl told him. The big boys here. Branad Claff. And a Paratime Police officer. They're in your office. I was expecting that, Stranis Leth nodded. Then he turned down the corridor to the left. 2 men were waiting for him, in his office. One was short and stocky, with an angry, impatient face. Branad Claff, Transtemporal's vice president in charge of operations. The other was tall and slender with handsome and entirely expressionless features. He wore a Paratime police officer's uniform, with the blue badge of hereditary nobility on his breast, and carried a Sigma Ray needle in a belt holster. "Were you waiting long, gentlemen?" Stranasleth asked. "I was holding sunset sacrifice up in the temple." "No, we just got here," Branadclaf said. "This is Verkenval, Mvrad of Narrows, special assistant to Chief Tortha of the Paratime Police, Stranasleth, our resident agent here." Stranasleth touched hands with Verkenval. "I've heard a lot about you, sir," he said. "Everybody working in Paratime has, of course. I'm sorry we have a situation here that calls for your presence. But since we have, I'm glad you're here in person. You know what our trouble is, I suppose?" "In a general way," Verkenval replied. "Chief Tortha and Branadclaf have given me the main outline, but I'd like to have you fill in the details." "Well, I told you everything," Branadclaf interrupted impatiently. "It's just that Strana's let this blasted local king, Kerchuk, get out of control." He stopped short, catching sight of the shoulder holster under Stranasleth's left arm. "Were you wearing that needle up in the temple?" he demanded. "You're blasted right I was," Stranasleth retorted. "And any time I can't arm myself for my own protection on this timeline, you can have my resignation. I'm not getting into the same jam as those people at Zerb." "Well, never mind about that," Verkenval intervened. "Of course Stranasleth has a right to arm himself. I wouldn't think of being caught without a weapon on this timeline, myself. Now, Strana, suppose you tell me what's been happening here, from the beginning of this trouble." "It started, really, about 5 years ago, when Kerchuk, the king of Zerb, married this Chuldan princess, Dareth, from the country over beyond the Black Sea, and made her his queen, over the heads of about a dozen daughters of the local nobility, whom he'd married previously. Then he brought in this Chuldan scribe, Labdurg, and made him overseer of the kingdom, roughly, prime minister. There was a lot of dissatisfaction about that, and for a while it looked as though he was going to have a revolution on his hands, but he brought in about 5,000 Chuldan mercenaries, all archers. These Hellguns can't shoot a bow worth pins, so the dissatisfaction died down, and so did most of the leaders of the disaffected group. The story I get is that this Labdurg arranged the marriage, in the first place. It looks to me as though the Chuldan Emperor is intending to take over the Hulgun kingdoms, starting with Zerb. Well, these Chuldans all worship a god called Muzazin. Muzazin is a crocodile with wings like a bat and a lot of knife blades in his tail. He makes this Yatazar look downright beautiful. So do his habits. Muzazin fancies human sacrifices. The victims are strung up by the ankles on a triangular frame and lashed to death with iron barbed whips. Nasty sort of a deity, but this is a nasty timeline. The people here get a big kick out of watching these sacrifices. Much better show than our bunny killing. The victims are usually criminals, or overage or incorrigible slaves, or prisoners of war. Of course, when the Chuldans began infiltrating the palace, they brought in their crocodile god, too, and a flock of priests, and King Kerchuk let them set up a temple in the palace. Naturally, we preached against this heathen idolatry in our temples, but religious bigotry isn't one of the numerous imperfections of this sector. Everybody's deity is as good as anybody else's. Indifferentism, I believe, is the theological term. Anyhow, on that basis things went along fairly well, till 2 years ago, when we had this run of bad luck. Bad luck? Branadclaf snorted. That's the standing excuse of every incompetent. Go on, Strana, what sort of bad luck? Verkenval asked. Well, first we had a drought, beginning in early summer, that burned up most of the grain crop. Then, when that broke, we got heavy rains and hailstorms and floods, and that destroyed what got through the dry spell. When they harvested what little was left, it was obvious there'd be a famine, so we brought in a lot of grain by conveyor and distributed it from the temple's miraculous gift of Yatazar, of course. Then the main office on first level got scared about flooding this timeline with a lot of unaccountable grain and were afraid we'd make the people suspicious, and ordered it stopped. Then Kerchuk, and I might add that the kingdom of Zerb was the hardest hit by the famine, ordered his army mobilized and started an invasion of the Jumdun country, south of the Carpathians, to get grain. He got his army chopped up, and only about a quarter of them got back, with no grain. You ask me, I'd say that Labdurg framed it to happen that way. He advised Kerchuk to invade, in the first place, and I mentioned my suspicion that Chombrog, the Juldan emperor, is planning to move in on the Hulgun kingdoms. Well, what would be smarter than to get Kerchuk's army smashed in advance? How did the defeat occur? Verkinvall asked. Any suspicion of treachery? Nothing you could put your finger on, except that the Jumdun seemed to have pretty good intelligence about Kerchuk's invasion route and battle plans. It could have been nothing worse than stupid tactics on Kerchuk's part. See, these Hulguns, and particularly the Zerb Hulguns, are spearmen. They fight in a fairly thin line, with heavy armed infantry in front and light infantry with throwing spears behind. The nobles fight in light chariots, usually at the center of the line, and that's where they were at this Battle of Jorm. Kerchuk himself was at the center, with his Juldan archers massed around him. The Jumduns use a lot of cavalry, with long swords and lances, and a lot of big chariots with 2 javelin men and a driver. Well, instead of ramming into Kerchuk's center, where he had his archers, they hit the extreme left and folded it up, and then swung around behind and hit the right from the rear. All the Juldan archers did was stand fast around the king and shoot anybody who came close to them. They were left pretty much alone. But the Hulgun spearmen were cut to pieces. The battle ended with Kerchuk and his nobles and his archers making a fighting retreat, while the Jumdun cavalry were chasing the spearmen every which way and cutting them down or lancing them as they ran. Well, whether it was Labdurg's treachery or Kerchuk's stupidity, in either case, it was natural for the archers to come off easiest and the Hulgun spearmen to pay the butcher's bill. But try and tell these knuckleheads anything like that. Muzazin protected the Julduns, and Yatazar let the Hulguns down, and that was all there was to it. The Zerb temples started losing worshippers, particularly the families of the men who didn't make it back from Jorm. If that had been all there'd been to it, though, it still wouldn't have hurt the mining operations, and we could have got by. But what really tore it was when the rabbits started to die. Stranasleth picked up a cigar from his desk and bit the end, spitting it out disgustedly. Tularemia, of course, he said, touching his lighter to the tip. When that hit, they started going over to Muzazin in droves, not only at Zerb but all over the 6 kingdoms. You ought to have seen the house we had for sunset sacrifice, this evening. About 200, and we used to get 2,000. It used to be all 2 men could do to lift the offering box at the door, afterward, and all the money we took in tonight I could put in one pocket. The high priest used language that would have been considered unclerical even among the Hulguns. Verkinvall nodded. Even without the quickie hypnomesh he had taken for this sector, he knew that the rabbit was domesticated among the Proto-Aryan Hulguns and was their chief meat animal. Hulgun rabbits were even a minor import on the first level, and could be had at all the better restaurants in cities like Dagobah. He mentioned that. That's not the worst of it, Stranasleth told him. See, the rabbit's sacred to Yatzar. Not taboo, just sacred. They have to use a specially consecrated knife to kill them. Consecrating rabbit knives has always been an item of temple revenue and they must say a special prayer before eating them. We could have got around the rest of it, even the Battle of Jorm punishment by Yatazar for the sin of apostasy, but Yatazar just wouldn't make rabbits sick. Yatazar thinks too well of rabbits to do that, and it had not been any use claiming he would. So there you are. Well, I take the attitude that this situation is the result of your incompetence, Branadclaf began, in a bully-ragging tone. You're not only the high priest of this temple, you're the acknowledged head of the religion in all the Hulgun kingdoms. You should have had more hold on the people than to allow anything like this to happen. Hold on the people. Stranasleth fairly howled, appealing to Verkinvall. What does he think a religion is, on this sector, anyhow? You think these savages dreamed up that 6-armed monstrosity, up there, to express their yearning for higher things, or to symbolize their moral ethos, or as a philosophical escape hatch from the dilemma of causation? They never even heard of such matters. On this sector, gods are strictly utilitarian. As long as they take care of their worshippers, They get their sacrifices, when they can't put out. They have to get out. How do you suppose these Chulduns, living in the Caucasus Mountains, got the idea of a god like a crocodile, anyhow? Why, they got it from Homran traders, people from down in the Nile Valley. They had a god, once, something basically like a billy goat, but he let them get licked in a couple of battles, so out he went. Why, all the deities on this sector have hyphenated names, because they're combinations of several deities, worshipped in one person. Do you know anything about the history of this sector? He asked the Paratime Police officer. Well, it develops from an alternate probability of what we call the Nilo-Mesopotamian Basic Sector Group, Verkanvol said. On most Nilo-Mesopotamian sectors, like the Macedonian Empire sector, or the Alexandrian Roman or Alexandrian Punic or Indo-Turanian or Europo-American, there was an Aryan invasion of Eastern Europe and Asia Minor about 4,000 elapsed years ago. On this sector, the ancestors of the Aryans came in about 15 centuries earlier, as Neolithic savages, about the time that the Sumerian and Egyptian civilizations were first developing, and overran all Southeast Europe, Asia Minor and the Nile Valley. They developed to the Bronze Age culture of the civilizations they overthrew, and then, more slowly, to an Iron Age culture. About 2,000 years ago, they were using hardened steel and building large stone cities, just as they do now. At that time, they reached cultural stasis. But as for their religious beliefs, you've described them quite accurately. A god is only worshipped as long as the people think him powerful enough to aid and protect them. When they lose that confidence, he is discarded and the god of some neighboring people is adopted instead. He turned to Branad Claff. Didn't Strana report this situation to you when it first developed? He asked. I know he did. He speaks of receiving shipments of grain by conveyor for temple distribution. Then why didn't you report it to Paratime Police? That's what we have a Paratime Police force for. Well, yes, of course, but I had enough confidence in Strana Sleth to think that he could handle the situation himself. I didn't know he'd gone slack. Look, I can't make weather, even if my parishioners think I can, Strana Sleth defended himself. And I can't make a great military genius out of a blockhead like Kirchuk. And I can't immunize all the rabbits on this timeline against tularemia, even if I'd had any reason to expect a tularemia epidemic, which I hadn't because the disease is unknown on this sector. This is the only outbreak of it anybody's ever heard of on any Proto-Aryan timeline. No, but I'll tell you what you could have done, Verkanvol told him. When this Kirchuk started to apostatize, you could have gone to him at the head of a procession of priests, all paratimers and all armed with energy weapons, and pointed out his spiritual duty to him, and if he gave you any back talk, you could have pulled out that needle and rayed him down and then cried, "Behold the vengeance of Yatizar upon the wicked king." I'll bet any sum at any odds that his successor would have thought twice about going over to Muzazin, and none of these other kings would have even thought once about it. Ha, that's what I wanted to do. Strana Sleth exclaimed. And who stopped me? I'll give you just one guess. Well, it seems there was slackness here, but it wasn't Strana Sleth who was slack, Verkanvol commented. Well, I must say, I never thought I'd hear an officer of the Paratime Police criticizing me for trying to operate inside the Paratime Transposition Code. Branad Claff exclaimed. Verkanvol, sitting on the edge of Strana Sleth's desk, aimed his cigarette at Branad Claff like a blaster. Now, look, he began. There is one, and only one, inflexible law regarding outtime activities. The secret of paratime transposition must be kept inviolate, and any activity tending to endanger it is prohibited. That's why we don't allow the transposition of any object of extraterrestrial origin to any timeline on which space travel has not been developed. Such an object may be preserved, and then, after the local population begin exploring the planet from whence it came, there will be dangerous speculations and theories as to how it arrived on Terra at such an early date. I came within inches, literally, of getting myself killed, not long ago, cleaning up the result of a violation of that regulation. For the same reason, we don't allow the export, to outtime natives, of manufactured goods too far in advance of their local culture. That's why, for instance, you people have to hand finish all those big Yatazar idols, to remove traces of machine work. One of those things may be around, a few thousand years from now, when these people develop a mechanical civilization. But as far as raying down this Kirchhoff is concerned, these hull guns are completely non-scientific. They wouldn't have the least idea what happened. They'd believe that Yatazar struck him dead, as gods on this plane of culture are supposed to do, and if any of them noticed the needle at all, they'd think it was just a holy amulet of some kind. But the law is the law, Branad Claff began. Verkenvol shook his head. Branad, as I understand, you were promoted to your present position on the retirement of Salvan Marth, about 10 years ago. Up to that time, you were in your company's financial department. You were accustomed to working subject to the first-level commercial regulation code. Now, any law binding upon our people at home, on the first level, is inflexible. It has to be. We found out, over 50 centuries ago, that laws have to be rigid and without discretionary powers in administration in order that people may be able to predict their effect and plan their activities accordingly. Naturally, you became conditioned to operating in such a climate of legal inflexibility. But in paratime, the situation is entirely different. There exist, within the range of the Guldran Hester paratemporal field generator, a number of timelines of the order of 10 to the 100,000th power. In effect, that many different worlds. In the past 10,000 years, we have visited only the tiniest fraction of these, but we have found everything from timelines inhabited only by subhuman ape-men to second-level civilizations which are our own equal in every respect but knowledge of paratemporal transposition. We even know of one second-level civilization which is approaching the discovery of an interstellar hyperspatial drive, something we've never even come close to. And in between are every degree of savagery, barbarism and civilization. Now, it's just not possible to frame any single code of laws applicable to conditions on all of these. The best we can do is prohibit certain flagrantly immoral types of activity, such as slave trading, introduction of new types of narcotic drugs, or out-and-out piracy and brigandage. If you're in doubt as to the legality of anything you want to do outtime, go to the Judicial Section of the Paratime Commission and get an opinion on it. That's where you made your whole mistake. You didn't find out just how far it was allowable for you to go. He turned to Strana Sleth again. Well, that's the background, then. Now tell me about what happened yesterday at Zerb. Well, a week ago, Kirchhoff came out with this decree closing our temple at Zerb and ordering his subjects to perform worship and make money offerings to Muzazin. The Zerb temple isn't a mosque for a mine, Zerb's too far south for the uranium deposits. It's just a center for propaganda and that sort of thing. But they have a house of Yatazar, and a conveyor, and most of the upper priests are paratimers. Well, our man there, Tamandruf, alias Koram, defied the king's order, so Kirchhoff sent a company of Chultan archers to close the temple and arrest the priests. Tamandruf got all his people who were in the temple at the time into the house of Yatazar and transposed them back to the first level. He had orders. Strana Sleth looked meaningly at Branad Claff not to resist with energy weapons or even ultrasonic paralyzers. And while we're on the subject of letting the local yokels see too much, about 15 of the underpriests he took to the first level were Hulgun natives. Nothing wrong about that, they'll get memory obliteration and pseudo-memory treatment, Verkenvol said. But he should have been allowed to needle about a dozen of those Chulduns. Teach the beggars to respect Yatazar in the future. Now, how about the 6 priests who were outside the temple at the time? All but one were paratimers. We'll have to find out about them, and get them out of Zerb. That'll take some doing, Strana Sleth said. And it'll have to be done before sunset tomorrow. They are all in the dungeon of the palace citadel, and Kirchhoff is going to give them to the priests of Muzazin to be sacrificed tomorrow evening. How'd you learn that? Verkenvol asked. Oh, we have a man in Zerb, not connected with the temple, Strana Sleth said. Name's Granarjurth, calls himself Grandeur, locally. He has a swordmaker's shop, employs about a dozen native journeymen and apprentices who hammer out the common blades he sells in the open market. Then, he imports a few high-class alloy steel blades from the first level, that'll cut through this local low-carbon armor like cheese. Fits them with locally made hilts and sells them at unbelievable prices to the nobility. He's swordsmith to the king, picks up all the inside palace dope. Of course, he was among the first to accept the new gospel and go over to Muzazin. He has a secret room under his shop, with his conveyor and a radio. What happened was this: these 6 priests were at a consecration ceremony at a rabbit ranch outside the city, and they didn't know about the raid on the temple. On their way back, they were surrounded by Juldan archers and taken prisoner. They had no weapons but their sacrificial knives. He threw another dirty look at Branad Claff. So they're due to go up on the triangles at sunset tomorrow. We'll have to get them out before then, Verkenvol stated. There are people, and we can't let them down. Even the native is under our protection, whether he knows it or not. And in the second place, if those priests are sacrificed to Muzazin, he told Branad Claff, you can shut down everything on this timeline, pull out or disintegrate your installations, and fill in your mine tunnels. Yatazar will be through on this timeline, and you'll be through along with him. And considering that your Fashionables franchise for this sector comes up for renewal next year, your company will be through in this paratime area. You believe that would happen? Branad Claff asked anxiously. I know it will, because I'll put through a recommendation to that effect, if those 6 men are tortured to death tomorrow, Verkenvol replied. And in the 50 years that I've been in the police department, I've only heard of 5 such recommendations being ignored by the commission. You know, 4th level Mineral Products Syndicate is after your franchise. Ordinarily, they wouldn't have a chance of getting it, but with this, maybe they will, even without my recommendation. This was all your fault, for ignoring Strana Sleth's proposal and for denying those men the right to carry energy weapons. Well, we were only trying to stay inside the Paratime Code, Branad Claff pleaded. If it isn't too late, now, you can count on me for every cooperation. He fiddled with some papers on the desk. What do you want me to do to help? I'll tell you that in a minute. Verkenvol walked to the wall and looked at the map, then returned to Strana Sleth's desk. How about these dungeons? He asked. How are they located, and how can we get into them? I'm afraid we can't, Strana Sleth told him. Not without fighting our way in. They're under the palace citadel, 100 feet below ground. They're spatially coexistent with the heavy water barriers around one of our company's plutonium piles on the 1st level, and below surface on any unoccupied timeline I know of, so we can't transpose into them. This palace is really a walled city inside a city. Here, I'll show you. Going around the desk, he sat down and, after looking in the index screen, punched a combination on the keyboard. A picture, projected from the microfilm bank, appeared on the view screen. It was an air view of the city of Zerb taken, the high priest explained, by infrared light from an airboat over the city at night. It showed a city of an entirely pre-mechanical civilization, with narrow streets, lined on either side by low 1- and 2-story buildings. Although there would be considerable snow in winter, the roofs were usually flat, probably massive stone slabs supported by pillars within. Even in the poorer sections, this was true except for the very meanest houses and outbuildings, which were thatched. Here and there, some huge pile of masonry would rear itself above its lower neighbors, and, where the streets were wider, occasional groups of large buildings would be surrounded by battlemented walls. Strana Sleth indicated one of the larger of these. Here's the palace, he said. And here's the temple of Yatazar, about half a mile away. He touched a large building, occupying an entire block. Between it and the palace was a block-wide park, with lawns and trees on either side of a wide roadway connecting the two. Now, here's a detailed view of the palace. He punched another combination. The view of the city was replaced by one, taken from directly overhead, of the walled palace area. Here's the main gate, in front, at the end of the road from the temple, he pointed out. Over here, on the left, are the slaves' quarters and the stables and workshops and storehouses and so on. Over here, on the other side, are the nobles' quarters. And this, he indicated a towering structure at the rear of the walled enclosure, is the citadel and the royal dwelling. Audience hall on this side, harem over here on this side. A wide stone platform, about 15 feet high, runs completely across the front of the citadel, from the audience hall to the harem. Since this picture was taken, the new temple of Muzazin was built right about here. He indicated that it extended out from the audience hall into the central courtyard. And out here on the platform, they've put up about a dozen of these triangles, about 12 feet high, on which the sacrificial victims are whipped to death. Yes. About the only way we could get down to the dungeons would be to make an airdrop onto the citadel roof and fight our way down with needlers and blasters, and I'm not willing to do that as long as there's any other way, Verkenvol said. We'd lose men, even with needlers against bows, and there's a chance that some of our equipment might be lost in the melee and fall into our time hands. You say this sacrifice comes off tomorrow at sunset. That will be about actual sunset plus or minus an hour. These people aren't astronomers, they don't even have good sundials, and it might be a cloudy day, Stranasleth said. There will be a big idol of Muzazin on a cart, set about here. He pointed. After the sacrifice, it is to be dragged down this road, outside, to the temple of Yatazar, and set up there. The temple is now occupied by about 20 Chuldan mercenaries and 5 or 6 priests of Muzazin. They haven't, of course, got into the house of Yatazar, the doors of impervium steel, about 6 inches thick, with a plating of collapsed nickel under the gilding. It would take a couple of hours to cut through it with our best atomic torch. There isn't a tool on this timeline that could even scratch it. And the insides of the walls are lined with the same thing. Do you think our people have been tortured, yet? Verkenvol asked. No. Stranasleth was positive. They'll be fairly well treated, until the sacrifice. The idea is to make them last as long as possible on the triangles. Muzazin likes to see a slow killing, and so does the mob of spectators. That's good. Now, here's my plan. We won't try to rescue them from the dungeons. Instead, we'll transpose back to the Zerb temple from the first level, in considerable force, say 100 or so men, and march on the palace, to force their release. You're in constant radio communication with all the other temples on this timeline, I suppose? Yes, certainly. All right. Pass this out to everybody, Authority Paratime Police, in my name, acting for Tor the Calf. I want all paratimers who can possibly be spared to transpose to first level immediately and rendezvous at the first level terminal of the Zerb Temple conveyor as soon as possible. Close down all mining operations, and turn over temple routine to the native under-priests. You can tell them that the upper priests are retiring to their respective houses of Yatazar to pray for the deliverance of the priests in the hands of King Kirchuk. And everybody is to bring back his priestly regalia to the first level. That will be needed. He turned to Branad Claff. I suppose you keep spare regalia in stock on the first level? Yes, of course, we keep plenty of everything in stock. Robes, mitres, full spears of different shades, everything, and these big Yatazar idols, they're mass-produced on the first level? You have one available now? Good. I'll want some alterations made on one. For one thing, I'll want it plated heavily, all over, with collapsed nickel. For another, I'll want it fitted with anti-grav units and some sort of propulsion units, and a loudspeaker, and remote control. And, Strana, you get in touch with this swordmaker, Kranarjerth, and alert him to cooperate with us. Tell him to start calling Zerb Temple on his radio about noon tomorrow, and keep it up till he gets an answer. Or, better, tell him to run his conveyor to his first level terminal, and bring with him an extra suit of clothes appropriate to the role of journeyman mechanic. I'll want to talk to him, and furnish him with special equipment. Got all that? Well, carry on with it, and bring your own paratimers, priests and mining operators, back with you as soon as you've taken care of everything. Branad, you come with me, now. We're returning to first level immediately. We have a lot of work to do, so let's get started. Anything I can do to help, just call on me for it, Branad Claff promised earnestly. And, Strana, I want to apologize. I'll admit, now, that I ought to have followed your recommendations, when this situation first developed. By noon of the next day, Verkenvol had at least 100 men gathered in the big room at the first-level Fissionables refinery at Jarnabar, spatially coexistent with the fourth-level temple of Yatazar at Zerb. He was having a little trouble distinguishing between them, for every man wore the fringed blue robe and golden mitre of an upper priest, and had his face masked behind a blue false beard. It was, he admitted to himself, a most ludicrous-looking assemblage. One of the most ludicrous things about it was the fact that it would have inspired only pious awe in a hull gun of the 4th-level Proto-Aryan sector. About half of them were priests from the Transtemporal Mining Corporation's temples, the other half were members of the Paratime Police. All of them wore, in addition to their temple knives, holstered Sigma Ray needlers. Most of them carried ultrasonic paralyzers, 18-inch baton-like things with bulbous ends. Most of the Paratime Police and a few of the priests also carried either heat ray pistols or neutron disruption blasters. Verkenvol wore one of the latter in a left-hand belt holster. The Paratime Police were lined up separately for inspection, and Strana Sleth, Tamandruf of the Zerg Temple, and several other high priests were checking the authenticity of their disguises. A little apart from the others, a Paratime policeman, in high priest's robes and beard, had a square box slung in front of him. He was fiddling with knobs and buttons on it, practicing. A big idol of Yatazar, on anti-gravity, was floating slowly about the room in obedience to its remote controls, rising and lowering, turning about and pirouetting gracefully. "Hey, Vol," he called to his superior. "How's this?" The idol rose about 5 feet, turned slowly in a half-circle, moved to the right a little, and then settled slowly toward the floor. "Fine, fine, Horf," Verkenvol told him, "but don't set it down on anything, or turn off the anti-gravity. There's enough collapsed nickel plating on that thing to sink it a yard in soft ground." "I don't know what the idea of that was," Branad Claff, standing beside him, said. "Understand, I'm not criticizing. I haven't any right to, under the circumstances. But it seems to me that armoring that thing in collapsed nickel was an unnecessary precaution." "Maybe it was," Verkenvol agreed. "I sincerely hope so. But we can't take any chances. This operation has to be absolutely right. Ready, Tamand? All right, first detail into the conveyor." He turned and strode toward a big dome of fine metallic mesh, 30 feet high and 60 in diameter, at the other end of the room. Tamandruf, and his 10 Paratimer priests, and Branad Claff, and 10 Paratime Police, followed him in. One of the latter slid shut the door and locked it. Verkenvol went to the control desk, at the center of the dome, and picked up a 2-foot globe of the same fine metallic mesh, opening it and making some adjustments inside, then attaching an electric cord and closing it. He laid the globe on the floor near the desk and picked up the hand battery at the other end of the attached cord. "Not taking any chances at all, are you?" Branad Claff asked, watching this operation with interest. "I never do, unnecessarily. There are too many necessary chances that have to be taken, in this work." Verkenvol pressed the button on the hand battery. The globe on the floor flashed and vanished. Yesterday, 5 Paratimers were arrested. Any or all of them could have had door activators with them. Strana Sleth says they were not tortured, but that is a purely inferential statement. They may have been, and the use of the activator may have been extorted from one of them. So I want to look at the inside of that conveyor chamber before we transpose into it. He laid the hand battery, with the loose dangling wire that had been left behind, on the desk, then lit a cigarette. The others gathered around, smoking and watching, careful to avoid the place from which the globe had vanished. 30 minutes passed, and then, in a queer iridescence, the globe reappeared. Verkenvol counted 10 seconds and picked it up, taking it to the desk and opening it to remove a small square box. This he slid into a space under the desk and flipped a switch. Instantly, a view screen lit up and a 3-dimensional picture appeared. The interior of a big room 100 feet square and some 70 in height. There was a big desk and a radio, tables, couches, chairs and an arms rack full of weapons, and at one end, a remarkably clean 60-foot circle on the concrete floor, outlined in faintly luminous red. "How about it?" Verkenvol asked Tamandruf. "Anything wrong?" The Zerb high priest shook his head. "Just as we left it," he said. "Nobody's been inside since we left." One of the policemen took Verkenvol's place at the control desk and threw the master switch, after checking the instruments. Immediately, the paratemporal transposition field went on with a humming sound that mounted to a high scream, then settled to a steady drone. The mesh dome flickered with a cold iridescence and vanished, and they were looking into the interior of a great fissionables refinery plant. operated by paratimers on another first-level timeline. The structural details altered, from timeline to timeline, as they watched. Buildings appeared and vanished. Once, for a few seconds, they were inside a cool, insulated bubble in the midst of molten lead. Tamandruf jerked a thumb at it, before it vanished. "That always bothers me," he said. "Bad place for the field to go weak. I'm fussy as an old hen about inspection of the conveyor, on account of that." "Don't blame you," Verkenvall agreed. "Probably the cooling system of a breeder pile." They passed more swiftly, now, across the second level and the third. Once they were in the midst of a huge land battle, with great tank-like vehicles spouting flame at one another. Another moment was spent in an air bombardment. On any timeline, this section of East Europe was a natural battleground. Once a great procession marched toward them, carrying red banners and huge pictures of a coarse-faced man with a black moustache. Verkenvall recognized the environment as fourth-level Europo-American sector. Finally, as the transposition rate slowed, they saw a clutter of miserable thatched huts, in the rear of a granite wall of a fourth-level Hulgun temple of Yatazare temple not yet infiltrated by Transtemporal Mining Corporation agents. Finally, they were at their destination. The dome around them became visible, and an overhead green light flashed slowly on and off. Verkenvall opened the door and stepped outside, his needle drawn. The house of Yatazar was just as he had seen it in the picture photographed by the automatic reconnaissance conveyor. The others crowded outside after him. One of the regular priests pulled off his mitre and beard and went to the radio, putting on a headset. Verkenvall and Tamandruf snapped on the visiscreen, getting a view of the Holy of Holies outside. There were 6 men there, seated at the upper priest's banquet table, drinking from golden goblets. 5 of them wore the black robes with green facings which marked them as priests of Muzazin. The 6th was an officer of the Chultan archers, in gilded mail and helmet. "Why, those are the sacred vessels of the temple!" Tamandruf cried, scandalized. Then he laughed in self-ridicule. "I'm beginning to take this stuff seriously, myself. Time I put in for a long vacation. I was actually shocked at the sacrilege." "Well, let's overtake the infidels in their sins," Verkenvall said. "Paralyzers will be good enough." He picked up one of the bulb-headed weapons, and unlocked the door. Tamandruf and another of the priests of the Zerb temple following and the others crowding behind. They passed out through the veils, and burst into the Holy of Holies. Verkenvall pointed the bulb of his paralyzer at the 6 seated men and pressed the button. Other paralyzers came into action, and the whole sextet were knocked senseless. The officer rolled from his chair and fell to the floor in a clatter of armor. 2 of the priests slumped forward on the table. The others merely sank back in their chairs, dropping their goblets. "Give each one of them another dose, to make sure," Verkenvall directed a couple of his own men. "Now, Tamand, any other way into the main temple beside that door?" "Up those steps," Tamandruf pointed. "There's a gallery along the side, we can cover the whole room from there. Take your men and go up there. I'll take a few through the door. There'll be about 20 archers out there, and we don't want any of them loosing any arrows before we can knock them out. 3 minutes be time enough?" "Easily." "Make it 2, Tamandruf said. He took his priests up the stairway and vanished into the gallery of the temple. Verkenvall waited until 1 minute had passed and then, followed by Branad Claff and a couple of paratime policemen, he went under the plinth and peered out into the temple. 5 or 6 archers, in steel caps and sleeveless leather jackets sewn with steel rings, were gathered around the altar, cooking something in a pot on the fire. Most of the others, like veteran soldiers, were sprawled on the floor, trying to catch a short nap, except half a dozen, who crouched in a circle, playing some game with dice and other almost universal military practice. The 2 minutes were up. He aimed his paralyzer at the men around the altar and squeezed the button, swinging it from one to another and knocking them down with a bludgeon of inaudible sound. At the same time, Tamandruf and his detail were stunning the gamblers. Stepping forward and to one side, Verkenvall, Branad Claff and the others took care of the sleepers on the floor. In less than 30 seconds, every Chultan in the temple was incapacitated. "All right, make sure none of them come out of it prematurely," Verkenvall directed. "Get their weapons, and be sure nobody has a knife or anything hidden on him. Who has the syringe and the sleep drug ampoules? Somebody had, it developed, who was still on the first level, to come up with the second conveyor load. Verkenvol swore. Something like this always happened, on any operation involving more than half a dozen men. Well, some of you stay here, patrol around, and use your paralyzers on anybody who even twitches a muscle. Ultrasonics were nice, effective, humane police weapons, but they were unreliable. The same dose that would keep one man out for an hour would paralyze another for no more than 10 or 15 minutes. And be sure none of them are playing possum. He went back through the door under the plinth, glancing up at the decorated wooden screen and wondering how much work it would take to move the new Yatazar in from the conveyors. The 5 priests and the archer captain were still unconscious. One of the policemen was searching them. Here's the sort of weapons these priests carry, he said, holding up a short iron mace with a spiked head. Carry them on their belts. He tossed it on the table, and began searching another knocked-out hierophant. Like this, hey? Look at this, will you? He drew his hand from under the left side of the senseless man's robe and held up a Sigma Ray needler. Verkenvol looked at it and nodded grimly. Had it in a regular shoulder holster, the policeman said, handing the weapon across the table. What do you think? Find anything else funny on him? Wait a minute. The policeman pulled open the robe and began stripping the priest of Muzazin. Verkenvol came around the table to help. There was nothing else of a suspicious nature. Could have got it from one of the prisoners, but I don't like the familiar way he's wearing that holster, Verkenvol said. Has the conveyor gone back, yet? When the policeman nodded, he continued, when it returns, take him to the first level. I hope they bring up the sleep drug with the next load. When you get him back, take him to Hugabar by strata rocket immediately, and make sure he gets back alive. I want him questioned under narco-hypnosis by a regular Paratime Commission psychotechnician, in the presence of Chief Torthakov and some responsible commission official. This is going to be hot stuff. Within an hour, the whole force was assembled in the temple. The wooden screen had presented no problem. It slid easily to one side and the big idol floated on anti-gravity in the middle of the temple. Verkenvol was looking anxiously at his watch. It's about 2 hours to sunset, he said, to Strana Sleth. But as you pointed out, these Helguns aren't astronomers, and it's a bit cloudy. I wish Cranage Earth would call in with something definite. Another 20 minutes passed. Then the man at the radio came out into the temple. Oh. K. He called. The man at Cranage Earth's called in. Cranage Earth contacted him with a midget radio he has up his sleeve. He's in the palace courtyard now. They haven't brought out the victims yet, but Kirchuk has just been carried out on his throne to that platform in front of the citadel. Big crowd gathering in the inner courtyard, more in the streets outside. Palace gates are wide open. That's it. Verkenvol cried. Form up. The parade's starting. Branad, you and Tamand and Strana and I in front, about 10 men with paralyzers a little behind us. Then Yatazar, about 10 feet off the ground, and then the others. Forward ho-oh. They emerged from the temple and started down the broad roadway toward the palace. There was not much of a crowd, at first. Most of Serb had flocked to the palace earlier, the lucky ones in the courtyard and the latecomers outside. Those whom they did meet stared at them in open-mouthed amazement, and then some, remembering their doubts and blasphemies, began howling for forgiveness. Others, a substantial majority realizing that it would be upon King Kirchuk that the real weight of Yatazar's 6 hands would fall, took to their heels, trying to put as much distance as possible between them and the palace before the blow fell. As the procession approached the palace gates, the crowds were thicker, made up of those who had been unable to squeeze themselves inside. The panic was worse, here, too. A good many were trampled and hurt in the rush to escape, and it became necessary to use paralyzers to clear a way. That made it worse. Everybody was sure that Yatazar was striking sinners dead left and right. Fortunately, the gates were high enough to let the god through without losing altitude appreciably. Inside, the mob surged back, clearing a way across the courtyard. It was only necessary to paralyze a few here, and the levitated idol and its priestly attendants advanced toward the stone platform, where the king sat on his throne, flanked by court functionaries and black-robed priests of Muzazin. In front of this, a rank of Chultan archers had been drawn up. Horf, move Yatazar forward about 100 feet and up about 50, Verkanvul directed. Quickly, as the six-armed anthropomorphic idol rose and moved closer toward its saurian rival, Verkanvul drew his needler, scanning the assemblage around the throne anxiously. "Where is the wicked king?" A voice thundered, the voice of Strana Sleth, speaking into a midget radio tuned to the loudspeaker inside the idol. "Where is the blasphemer and desecrator, Kerchuk?" "There's Labturg, in the red tunic, beside the throne," Tamandruth whispered. "And that's Gromda, the Muzazin high priest, beside him." Verkanvul nodded, keeping his eyes on the group on the platform. Gromda, the high priest of Muzazin, was edging backward and reaching under his robe. At the same time, an officer shouted an order, and the Chultan archers drew arrows from their quivers and fitted them to their bowstrings. Immediately, the ultrasonic paralyzers of the advancing paratimers went into action, and the mercenaries began dropping. "Lay down your weapons, fools!" The amplified voice boomed at them. "Lay down your weapons or you shall surely die. Who are you, miserable wretches, to draw bows against me?" At first a few, then all of them, the Chultans lowered or dropped their weapons and began edging away to the sides. At the center, in front of the throne, most of them had been knocked out. Verkanvul was still watching the Muzazin high priest intently, as Gromd raised his arm. There was a flash and a puff of smoke from the front of Yatazar. The paint over the collapsed nickel was burned off, but otherwise the idol was undamaged. Verkanvul swung up his needler and raid Gromda dead. As the man in the green-faced black robes fell, a blaster clattered on the stone platform. "Is that your puny best, Muzazin?" the booming voice demanded. "Where is your high priest now?" "Horf, face Yatazar toward Muzazin," Verkanvul said over his shoulder, drawing his blaster with his left hand. Like all first-level people, he was ambidextrous, although, like all paratimers, he habitually concealed the fact while out time. As the levitated idol swung slowly to look down upon its enemy on the built-up cart, Verkanvul aimed the blaster and squeezed, in a spot less than a millimeter in diameter on the crocodile idol's side, a certain number of neutrons in the atomic structure of the stone from which it was carved broke apart, becoming, in effect, atoms of hydrogen. With a flash and a bang, the idol burst and vanished. Yatazar gave a dirty laugh and turned his back on the cart, which was now burning fiercely, facing King Kerchuk again. "Get your hands up, all of you!" Verkanvul shouted, in the first-level language, swinging the stubby muzzle of the blaster and the knob-tipped twin tubes of the needler to cover the group around the throne. "Come forward, before I start blasting." Labturg raised his hands and stepped forward. So did two of the priests of Yatazar. They were quickly seized by paratime policemen who swarmed up onto the platform and disarmed. All three were carrying Sigma-A needlers, and Labturg had a blaster as well. King Kerchuk was clinging to the arms of his throne, a badly frightened monarch trying desperately not to show it. He was a big man, heavy-shouldered, black-bearded. Under ordinary circumstances he would probably have cut an imposing figure, in his gold-washed mail and his golden crown. Now his face was a dirty gray, and he was biting nervously at his lower lip. The others on the platform were in even worse state. The Hulgun nobles were grouped together, trying to disassociate themselves from both the king and the priests of Muzazin. The latter were staring in a daze at the blazing cart from which their idol had just been blasted. And the dozen men who were to have done the actual work of the torture sacrifice had all dropped their whips and were fairly gibbering in fear. Yatazar, manipulated by the robed paratimer, had taken a position directly above the throne and was lowering slowly. Kerchuk stared up at the massive idol descending toward him, his knuckles white as he clung to the arms of his throne. He managed to hold out until he could feel the weight of the idol pressing on his head. Then, with a scream, he hurled himself from the throne and rolled forward almost to the edge of the platform. Yatazar moved to one side, swung slightly and knocked the throne toppling, and then settled down on the platform. To Kerchuk, who was rising cautiously on his hands and knees, the big idol seemed to be looking at him in contempt. "Where are my holy priests, Kerchuk?" Strana Sleth demanded into his sleeve-hidden radio. "Let them be brought before me, alive and unharmed, or it shall be better for you had you never been born." The 6 priests of Yatazar, it seemed, were already being brought onto the platform by one of Kerchuk's nobles. This noble, whose name was Yorzuk, knew a miracle when he saw one, and believed in being on the side of the god with the heaviest artillery. As soon as he had seen Yatazar coming through the gate without visible means of support, he had hastened to the dungeons with 6 of his personal retainers and ordered the release of the 6 captives. He was now escorting them onto the platform, assuring them that he had always been a faithful servant of Yatazar and had been deeply grieved at his sovereign's apostasy. "Hear my word, Kerchuk," Stranasleth continued through the loudspeaker in the idol. "You have sinned most vilely against me, and were I a cruel god, your fate would be such as no man has ever before suffered. But I am a merciful god. Behold, you may gain forgiveness in my sight. For 30 days, you shall neither eat meat nor drink wine, nor shall you wear gold nor fine raiment, and each day shall you go to my temple and beseech me for my forgiveness. And on the 31st day, you shall set out, barefoot and clad in the garb of a slave, and journey to my temple that is in the mountains over above Yoldath, and there will I forgive you, after you have made sacrifice to me. I, Yatazar, have spoken." The king started to rise, babbling thanks. "Rise not before me until I have forgiven you." Yatazar thundered. "Creep out of my sight upon your belly, wretch." The procession back to the temple was made quietly and sedately along an empty roadway. Yatazar seemed to be in a kindly humor. The people of Zerb had no intention of giving him any reason to change his mood. The priests of Muzazin and their torturers had been flung into the dungeon. Yorzuk, appointed regent for the duration of Kerchuk's penance, had taken control and was employing Helgun spearmen and hastily converted Juldan archers to restore order and, incidentally, purge a few of his personal enemies and political rivals. The priests, with the 3 prisoners who had been found carrying first-level weapons among them and Yatazar floating triumphantly in front, entered the temple. A few of the devout, who sought admission after them, were told that elaborate and secret rites were being held to cleanse the profaned altar, and sent away. Verkenval and Branadclaf and Stranasleth were in the conveyor chamber, with the paratime policemen and the extra priests. Along with them were the 3 prisoners. Verkenval pulled off his false beard and turned to face these. He could see that they all recognized him. "Now," he began, "you people are in a bad jam. You've violated the Paratime Transposition Code, the Commercial Regulation Code, and the First-Level Criminal Code, all together. If you know what's good for you, you'll start talking. I'm not saying anything till I have legal advice," the man who had been using the local alias of Labdurg replied. "And if you're through searching me, I'd like to have my cigarettes and lighter back. Smoke one of mine, for a change," Verkenval told him. "I don't know what's in yours beside tobacco." He offered his case and held a light for the prisoner before lighting his own cigarette. "I'm going to be sure you get back to the first level alive." The former overseer of the Kingdom of Zerb shrugged. "I'm still not talking," he said. "Well, we can get it all out of you by narco-hypnosis, anyhow," Verkenval told him. "Besides, we got that man of yours who was here at the temple when we came in. He's being given a full treatment, as a presumed outtime native found in possession of first-level weapons. If you talk now it'll go easier with you." The prisoner dropped the cigarette on the floor and tramped it out. "Anything you cops get out of me, you'll have to get the hard way," he said. "I have friends on the first level who'll take care of me." "I doubt that. They'll have their hands full taking care of themselves, after this gets out." Verkenval turned to the 2 in the black robes. "Either of you want to say anything?" When they shook their heads, he nodded to a group of his policemen. They were hustled into the conveyor. "Take them to the first-level terminal and hold them till I come in. I'll be along with the next conveyor load." The conveyor flashed and vanished. Branadclaf stared for a moment at the circle of concrete floor from whence it had disappeared. Then he turned to Verkenval. "I still can't believe it," he said. "Why, those fellows were first-level paratimers. So was that priest, Gromda, the one you raid." "Yes, of course. They worked for your rivals, the 4th-level Mineral Products Syndicate, the outfit that was trying to get your Proto-Aryan Sector Fissionables franchise away from you. They operate on this sector already, have the petroleum franchise for the Chuldan country. east of the Caspian Sea. They export to some of these internal combustion engine sectors, like Europo-American. You know, most of the wars they've been fighting, lately, on the Europo-American sector have been, at least in part, motivated by rivalry for oil fields. But now that the Europo-Americans have begun to release nuclear energy, fissionables have become more important than oil. In less than a century, it's predicted that atomic energy will replace all other forms of power. Mineral Products Syndicate wanted to get a good source of supply for uranium, and your Proto-Aryan sector franchise was worth grabbing. I had considered something like this as a possibility when Strana, here, mentioned that tularemia was normally unknown in Eurasia on this sector. That epidemic must have been started by imported germs. And I knew that Mineral Products has agents at the court of the Chuldan Emperor, Chomborog. They have to protect their oil wells on his eastern frontiers. I spent most of last night checking up on some stuff by video transcription from the Paratime Commission's microfilm library at Hagaba. I found out, for one thing, that while there is a King Kirchuk of Zerb on every timeline for 100 para-years on either side of this one, this is the only timeline on which he married a Princess Terith of Chuldan, and it's the only timeline on which there is any trace of a Chuldan scribe named Labdurg. That's why I went to all the trouble of having that Yatazar plated with collapsed nickel. If there were disguised paratimers among the Muzazin party at Kirchuk's court, I expected one of them to try to blast our idol when we brought it into the palace. I was watching Gromda and Labdurg in particular. As soon as Gromda used his blaster, I needled him. After that, it was easy. Was that why you insisted on sending that automatic viewer on ahead? Yes. There was a chance that they might have planted a bomb in the house of Yatazar, here. I knew they'd either do that or let the place entirely alone. I suppose they were so confident of getting away with this that they didn't want to damage the conveyor or the conveyor chamber. They expected to use them, themselves, after they took over your company's franchise. Well, what's going to be done about it by the commission? Branad Claff wanted to know. Plenty. The syndicate will probably lose their Paratime license. Any of its officials who had guilty knowledge of this will be dealt with according to law. You know, this was a pretty nasty business. You're telling me? Strana Sleth exclaimed. Did you get a look at those whips they were going to use on our people? Pointed iron bulbs a quarter-inch long braided into them, all over the lash ends. Yes. Any punitive action you're thinking about taking on these priests of Muzazin the natives, will be ignored on the first level. And that reminds me, you'd better work out a line of policy, pretty soon. Well, as for the priests and the torturers, I think I'll tell Yorzuk to have them sold to the Bungans, to the east. They're always in the market for galley slaves, Strana Sleth said. He turned to Branad Claff. And I'll want 6 gold crowns made up, as soon as possible. Strictly Hulgun design, with Yatazar religious symbolism, very rich and ornate, all slightly different. When I give Kirchuk absolution, I'll crown him at the altar in the name of Yatazar. Then I'll invite in the other 5 Hulgun kings, lecture them on their religious duties, make them confess their secret doubts, forgive them, and crown them, too. From then on, they can all style themselves as ruling by the will of Yatazar. And from then on, you'll have all of them eating out of your hand, Verk and Volk included. You know, this will probably go down in Hulgun history as the Reformation of Gulam the Holy. I've always wondered whether the theory of the divine right of kings was invented by the kings, to establish their authority over the people, or by the priests, to establish their authority over the kings. It works about as well one way as the other. What I can't understand is this, Branad Claff said. It was entirely because of my respect for the Paratime Code that I kept Strana Sleth from using 4th-level weapons and other techniques to control these people with a show of apparent miraculous powers. But this 4th-level Mineral Products Syndicate was operating in violation of the Paratime Code by invading our franchise area. Why didn't they fake up a supernatural reign of terror to intimidate these natives? Exactly because they were operating illegally, Verkenvol replied. Suppose they had started using needlers and blasters and anti-gravity and nuclear energy around here. The natives would have thought it was the power of Muzazin, of course, but what would you have thought? You'd have known, as soon as they tried it, that first-level paratimers were working against you, and you'd have laid the facts before the commission, and this timeline would have been flooded with paratime police. They had to conceal their operations not only from the natives, as you do, but also from us. So they didn't dare make public use of first-level techniques. Of course, when he came marching into the palace with that idol on anti-gravity, they knew, at once, what was happening. I have an idea that they only tried to blast that idol to create a diversion which would permit them to escape. If they could have got out of the palace, they'd have made their way, in disguise, to the nearest mineral products syndicate conveyor and transposed out of here. I realized that they could best delay us by blasting our idol, and that's why I had it plated with collapsed nickel. I think that where they made their mistake was in allowing Kirchuk to have those priests arrested, and insisting on sacrificing them to Muzazin. If it hadn't been for that, the paratime police wouldn't have been brought into this, at all. Well, Strana, you'll want to get back to your temple, and Branad and I want to get back to the first level. I'm supposed to take my wife to a banquet in Dagobah, tonight, and with the fastest strata rocket, I'll just barely make it.